Your Highness, the great Ming dynasty is gone. That was the first thing I heard when I opened my eyes. I had transmigrated. The good news was that I was about to become the emperor of the great Ming. The bad news? The great Ming didn't exist anymore. I lay on the bed, staring blankly at the ornate decorations inside the carriage. My mind was spinning. What did you say? I muttered. I am the Prince of Gue Zhu Yulang. Beside me, a young eunuch was kneeling on the floor. He was sobbing so hard he could barely breathe, his forehead hitting the wood with a dull thud. Your Highness, I deserve 10,000 deaths. I allowed Your Highness to be frightened. I deserve 10,000 deaths. If anyone asked who the most tragic emperor in Chinese history was, the Yongle Emperor, Zhu Yulang, was a top contender. People talk about the Chongzhen Emperor, but at least that guy held the throne for over a decade. By the time Yongle took over, the Ming was already a ghost. History remembers the Han, the Jin, and the Song dynasties having two parts, Western and Eastern, Northern and Southern. But there is no second Ming. Why? Because the Southern Ming wasn't a real government. It was a traveling circus of refugees. From Jiangnan to Yunnan, they fought and they fled. They never had a stable capital. It had been 2.5 years since the Chongzhen Emperor died on Coal Hill. The regimes in Nanjing and Fujian had already been crushed by the Qing army. Now, the burden of the fallen dynasty fell on the Prince of Gue in Guangxi. What was left of our territory? Guizhou, Guangxi, and Guangdong. And even those were slipping away. Rebellion had broken out in Yunnan, and the remnants of Zhang Xianzhong's rebel army were moving in. In the north, the Qing generals were cutting through Ming forces like a hot knife through butter. This wasn't a remnant government. It was a pack of fugitives. In history, Yongle reigned for 16 years. Half of that time was spent running, and the other half was spent under house arrest. If my memory served me right, before I even officially took the throne, the Qing army would reach Guangzhou. My ministers and I would panic and flee west. For over a decade, I would measure the southwest of China with my feet, running from Guangdong to Guangxi, then Guizhou, Sichuan, and Yunnan. Finally, I'd flee to Burma, only to be sold out by the Burmese king and handed over to the traitor Wu Sangui. He would strangle me to death with a bowstring. My heart hammered against my ribs. Today was the 22nd day of the 10th month. I was scheduled to ascend the throne in 2 months. On the 16th, news of Guangzhou's fall arrived. My court hadn't even finished celebrating my new role as Prince Regent before they started packing their bags. The Grand Secretary, Chu Shirsi, had tried to stop the retreat. It didn't work. Like a flock of startled birds, the entire court had fled Zhaoqing 3 days ago. We were currently 50 miles away. I sat up. It wasn't too late. In my past life, I had read the history of the Southern Ming. I knew what was coming. In December, the infamous traitor Li Qingdong would slaughter his way through Guangdong. If I kept running west, I was dead. History proved that running was the fatal mistake. By fleeing to Guangxi, the Prince of Tang would take the throne in Guangzhou first, causing a civil war within the Ming that gave the Qing an easy opening. I didn't want to die. I couldn't leave Guangdong. I had to go back to Zhaoqing immediately. The carriage curtain was pulled aside. The young eunuch flattened himself against the floor as 2 women entered. One was a middle-aged woman in regal robes. The other was young, elegant, and beautiful. Behind them followed an older eunuch. These were my mother, Empress Dowager Ma, and my wife, Empress Wang. The eunuch was Wang Kuan. My son, my mother said, her eyes full of concern. Are you feeling better? Is there any pain? Today was the first day of our flight, but fate had stepped in. My carriage axle had snapped while we were moving, and I had hit my head against the wall, knocking me unconscious. That's when the me from the modern world took over. It was a sign. I couldn't run anymore. Mother, I am fine, I said, my voice steady. Is Chu Shirsi still with the column? Chu Shirsi was one of the few loyalists I remembered, alongside Li Dinghua and Zheng Qinggong. My mother blinked in surprise. Did you not order him to stay behind in Zhaoqing? I stiffened. Right. The historical Zhu Yulang had ignored Chu Shirsi's pleas and left him behind to hold a doomed city. I threw off my silk blankets and climbed out of bed. I looked at Wang Kuan. Go out there. Call every official in charge to the carriage. I have orders. My son, what is wrong? My mother looked terrified, probably thinking I'd hit my head too hard. Don't worry, mother. It's just... I paused, crafting a story on the fly. While I was unconscious, I had a dream. The founding emperor appeared to me. He scolded me. He showed me our future, how we flee to Wuzhou, how the Qing hunt us through the mountains for 16 years. I saw us dying in Burma. I saw our family slaughtered. I spoke with such conviction that she went pale. In this era, dreams were messages from the divine. And my story wasn't a lie. It was the brutal reality of the timeline I was trying to escape. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of boots and hushed voices outside. The court had gathered. I comforted my wife and mother, then stepped out of the carriage. Greetings, Your Highness. I waved them off. Who is in charge of the transport? A young general in ceremonial armor stepped forward. I am, Your Highness. Ma Jixiang, commander of the Jinyue? I asked. He nodded. Order everyone to turn around. We are going back to Zhaoqing. The crowd of officials fell into a shocked silence. 2 days ago, I was the one screaming to run to Wuzhou. Now I wanted to head back toward the enemy? A middle-aged civil official dropped to his knees, trembling. Your Highness, we already decided to move to Wuzhou. Why this sudden change? Please, take back this order. Ganzhou has fallen. Zhaoqing is in mortal danger. If I guess correctly, this was Ding Kuei-chu, the head of the cabinet and the mastermind behind the retreat. He and the eunuch Wang Kuan had whispered in my ear, convincing me to run. Think of the situation, Your Highness, his followers cried out in unison. I have thought about it, I snapped. I'm not running. When the rebels hit Beijing, the Chongzhen Emperor didn't run. When the Qing hit Fujian, the Longwu Emperor didn't run. If I, Zhu Yulang, run today, how can I ever face my ancestors in the afterlife? The officials stared at me like I'd grown a second head. They remembered the man who had been crying and begging to leave just days ago. Your Highness, we do not fear death, Ding Kuei-chu stammered. But the Qing are too strong. We must avoid their edge. We must look at the big picture and plan carefully. Plan carefully? I scoffed. Everything in this world is ruined by planning carefully. Every failed campaign in our history started with planning carefully. When the Yongle Emperor moved the capital to Beijing, he put himself on the front lines. He told the world, the emperor guards the gate, and the king dies for his country. Are you telling me I am less than my ancestors? I stared them down, using every ounce of moral weight the Ming name still carried. I wasn't just talking to them. I was fighting for my life. Ding Kuei-chu finally reached his breaking point. He couldn't stay silent anymore. Your Highness, why do this? He demanded, his voice trembling with frustration. Wasn't it you who ordered the retreat to the west in the first place? How can you change such a major command now? We are going back to Zhaoqing, but what happens when the Qing army pushes south? When you are forced to flee again, what will you do then? I looked at him, seeing the hidden contempt in his eyes. I knew what he was thinking. He thought I was the same old Zhu Yulang, a coward who wavered at the first sign of trouble. He thought I was just being difficult for the sake of it. I didn't answer immediately. I just stared at him. I knew most of the officials felt the same way. I couldn't entirely blame them. This country had let them down over and over again. From Beijing to Guangdong, the Qing army had been unstoppable. Jinan, Yangzhou, Nanjing, Zhenjiang, one by one, the great fortresses had fallen. Armies scattered like frightened birds. And the Ming court? It was a disaster. While the enemy was at the gates, the officials were busy with internal power struggles. The previous emperors were either victims of infighting or puppets of powerful families. This was the southern Ming I knew from the history books back in my own time. It was a story of wasted potential and blood-boiling betrayal. Great heroes like Li Dinghua and Zheng Qinggong gave their lives, while the scholars and officials bickered over scraps until the very end. Ding Kuei-chu thought I would run the moment things got tough. But I had found my reason to stay. History showed that running didn't work. You just died miserably in some corner of the world. I would rather take a stand. I owed it to the people, from the northern borders to the southern mountains, who were being treated like slaves by the invaders. I owed it to the backbone of this nation. You all know my carriage had an accident recently, I said, breaking the silence. I hit my head. The officials looked at each other. They had noticed I had changed since I woke up. I wasn't soft or weak anymore. I carried an air of authority they weren't used to. I had a dream, I continued, my voice low and cold. In that dream, the founding emperor cursed me. He called me a disgrace. I saw myself fleeing like a dog while the Qing hunted me down. I saw my wife and children slaughtered. I saw my mother driven to her death. And finally, I saw myself being strangled to death with a bowstring. Behind me, my mother, Lady Ma, and my wife, Lady Wang, had stepped out of their carriage. Hearing my words, they began to weep. Many of the officials lowered their heads, their eyes welling with tears. Ding Koichu, however, just turned pale and stayed silent. Ma Jixiang, give me your blade, I commanded. The guard was confused, but he didn't dare disobey. He unbuckled his spring-embroidered saber and presented it with both hands. Everyone watched me, wondering what I was about to do. I pulled the hairpin from my head. My long, dark hair fell over my shoulders like a waterfall. Before anyone could react, I drew the blade. The cold steel flashed in the light. Your Highness, someone screamed. I didn't hesitate. I swung the blade, and several locks of my hair drifted to the ground. My mother lunged toward me, overcome with emotion, but my wife held her back. She understood. She saw what I was doing. The officials fell to their knees, sobbing. Your Highness, why go to such lengths? I have heard that a general who flees the battlefield deserves death, I said, holding the blade. I am the Prince Regent. I command the armies of this land, yet I broke the law by trying to flee. By right, I should execute myself. But the country is in danger, and I must live to preserve our ancestral line. Therefore, I cut my hair to represent my head. This is my vow. Ding Koichu stared at the hair on the ground. He realized then that if he didn't beg for mercy, he was a dead man. He trembling hands removed his official hat, and he slammed his forehead against the ground. I am guilty, he cried. I beg for your punishment. Where is the secretariat? I called out. A young official scrambled forward. I am here, Your Highness. Take an order, I snapped. Remove Ding Koichu from his posts as head of the cabinet and minister of war. He is old and frail. Grant him 100 taels of silver and let him retire to his hometown. I thank Your Highness for your grace, Ding Koichu stammered. He knew I was being generous. In the Ming dynasty, the emperor's word was absolute. I could have had his head. By sparing him, I was showing mercy while still removing the biggest obstacle to my rule. Then there was Wang Kuan, the head eunuch. He was kneeling, banging his head against the dirt until his forehead was bloody. This servant deserves death. Please, master, punish me. You're finished at the Directorate of Ceremonial Affairs, I told him. From today, that office is abolished. The cabinet will handle the memorials, and the important ones come directly to me. As for you, go tend the horses. Thank you, master. Wang Kuan sobbed, his face covered in blood and dust. Everyone, get ready, I announced to the crowd. We are heading back to Zhaoqing immediately. We obey your command, the officials shouted in unison. Meanwhile, back in Zhaoqing, Chu Shirsi was sitting at his desk, buried under a mountain of bad news. Reports from every front were grim. The Qing were closing in. At nearly 60 years old, his hair was almost entirely white from the stress. In just 2 years, 3 Ming emperors had died. The court had been chased all the way to the southern edge of the country. And now, the last remaining prince had fled in terror to Guangxi. Chu Shirsi felt a deep, crushing sorrow. He felt like he was watching the end of the world. Lord Chu, a young voice shouted from outside. Chu Shirsi looked up as Wang Fuji, a young scholar who had joined the resistance, burst into the room. Usually, the young man was calm and composed. Today, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. What is it? Why are you so frantic? Chu Shirsi asked. Your Highness, the prince is back. Wang Fuji gasped. He's returned to Zhaoqing. A messenger arrived ahead of the carriage. He'll be here tomorrow. Wang Fuji quickly recounted everything that had happened on the road. The dream, the vow, and the cutting of the hair. This is the spirit of the founding emperors, Chu Shirsi whispered, his eyes turning red. Has heaven finally taken pity on the Ming? On the 23rd day of the 10th month, I arrived at the gates of Zhaoqing. Chu Shirsi and the remaining officials were there to meet me. I didn't wait for the formalities. I stepped down from the carriage and walked straight toward the old man with the white hair. I reached out and caught Chu Shirsi before he could fully bow. His hands were thin, almost skeletal. Lord Chu, There is no need for such ceremony, I said, my voice steady. In the past, I was young and ignorant. I failed the state. I only hope you can forgive my past mistakes and continue to serve with your loyal heart. Then, I did something that shocked everyone. I folded my hands and bowed deeply to him. Chu Shirsi froze. Then, he collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his weathered face. My family has served the Ming for 3 generations, he sobbed. We have lived on the Emperor's grace. Serving you is my duty. How can I possibly deserve such an honor from your highness? I looked at this old man, his face lined with the stress of a collapsing empire, and felt a surge of respect. In the history I knew, when the Qing army eventually swept south, most officials fled or surrendered. But not Chu Shirsi. He stayed behind to defend Gilan, buying time for the court to escape. Even when captured, he refused to kneel. He mocked his captors and chose death over betrayal, writing a final poem about his loyalty before being executed. If men like this were the backbone of the Chinese spirit, how could I not fight? I pulled him up with my own hands. I turned to the crowd of officials standing by the gates and raised my voice so everyone could hear. Gentlemen, in the past, I neglected my duties. I failed our ancestors. But from this day forward, we will drive out the invaders and reclaim our capital. I need your help. Do not let my past failings keep you from standing by me now. The officials were moved. They knelt as one, their voices echoing off the city walls. We wouldn't dare. We are willing to die for your highness. I turned back and called out, Where is the secretary? A man stepped forward. I am here, your highness. Draft an edict, I commanded. Appoint Chu Shirsi as senior grand secretary of the inner cabinet and junior preceptor to the crown prince. He is to lead the government. Chu Shirsi trembled. He had served for over 20 years, but he had never been treated with such absolute trust. I took his shaking arm in mine. Lord Chu, I whispered, will you be my zhuge. Will you help me save this land? I cannot compare myself to the great marquis, he choked out. But I will give my life until my heart stops beating. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The gloom that had hung over the court for years seemed to lift. We boarded the carriages and entered Zhaoqing in high spirits. Once inside the government office, we got straight to work. I'll admit, I'm a political novice. My knowledge of statecraft came from novels and history books. I didn't know the first thing about managing an army of thousands. But I had one massive advantage. I knew who to trust. I knew who the traitors were and who would die for the cause. That was why I had fired Ding Koechu the moment I woke up and ran straight to Chu Shirsi. Lord Chu, I asked, what is the current situation on the front? The Qing have taken Guangzhou, he explained, his expression darkening. But our forces in Huguang are still holding. The enemy won't risk a full southern push while their flank is exposed. However, we must watch out for the generals Li Changdong and Tong Yangjia. They are aggressive. I nodded. In history, it was exactly those two who led the lightning strike on Guangzhou that caused the entire region to fall. How many men do we actually have? I asked. I needed to know my budget for the upcoming war. In Zhaoqing, we have about 20,000, Chu Shirsi reported. There are 4,000 at Shaoguan and 5,000 in Guangzhou. That's the Guangdong force. We have another 4,000 in Guangxi and about 5,000 tribal troops we can call upon. The rest belong to the commanders in Huguang, He Tengjiao, Zhang Quang, and Du Yinshi. He hesitated when he mentioned the Huguang armies. I noticed the change in his tone. You seem reluctant to talk about them, I said. Why? Chu Shirsi looked uncomfortable. Does your highness not remember the loyal camp? It clicked. The loyal camp was the remnant of Li Ziqing's peasant rebel army. These were the men who had originally toppled the Ming in Beijing. After the Qing invaded, these rebels turned their blades against the foreigners and joined the Ming resistance. But the Ming officials hated them. To the scholars, these men were still bandits who had killed the last emperor. They didn't trust them, and that distrust was exactly why the southern Ming eventually collapsed. But I wasn't like the old officials. I knew that while the loyal Ming generals were busy surrendering to the Qing, it was these bandits, like Li Dinghua and the loyal camp, who fought to the very last drop of blood for the nation. How many men does the loyal camp have? I asked eagerly. Li Gua and Gao Yigong have over 30,000 under the supervision of He Tingjiao, Chu Shirsi replied. Ma Jinzhong has another 20,000 under Du Yinshi. I frowned. He Tingjiao was a loyal man, but he was a terrible general and a petty politician. He treated the peasant rebels like dirt, which caused constant friction. I had to get him out of there. He Tingjiao is the governor of Huguang, right? I asked. And Zhang Quang. Yes, Your Highness. Issue an order, I said firmly. Recall He Tingjiao to the capital to serve as Minister of Personnel. Promote Zhang Quang to a position in the Ministry of Revenue. Send Du Yinshi to take over as the governor of Huguang. Chu Shirsi looked worried. Your Highness, those rebels, can they really be trusted? The enemy is at the gates, I replied. Military necessity comes first. We will handle the rest later. He didn't push further. With Du Yinshi in charge of the peasant armies, the northern front would be stable for a while. Now, I had to focus on the immediate threat, the traitor Li Qingdong. Lord Chu, I said, we need to reorganize the Guangdong army. Who can lead them? I recommend 2 men, Chu Shirsi said. Chen Bangyin and Zhang Jiayu. Chen is upright and knows defense. Zhang is a man of action, a hero who knows how to lead men from the shadows. I nodded. I remembered those names. They were martyrs. It was time to give them the power they needed to change history. I remembered Chen Bangyin and Zhang Jiayu from history. They were 2 of the 3 loyalists of Lingnan, men who eventually gave their lives for the country. I wasn't going to let their talents go to waste. I immediately ordered Zhang Jiayu to be appointed as the right vice minister of war and promoted Chen Bangyin to censor-in-chief to oversee military affairs in Guangdong. As I listened to Chu Shirsi describe Zhang Jiayu's bravery, another name flashed through my mind. This man was similar to Zhang, but even more legendary. In my world, he was known as one of the 3 heroes of West Lake, alongside Yu Fei and Yu Qian. His name was Zhang Huanyan. Unlike many southern Ming officials who were loyal but incompetent, Zhang Huanyan was a true powerhouse. In my history, he led the resistance against the Qing for over 20 years, long after or rather, the original Emperor Yongli, had died. Most Ming officials were bogged down by the pedantic infighting of the Donglin party, but Zhang Huanyan, Li Dinghua, and Du Yinshi were the only 3 men I trusted to truly lead an army and govern a state. Even Zheng Qinggong, the famous Koxinga, was a bit too complicated to fully rely on. His faction was a mess of private interests that had sidelined previous emperors. Where is Zhang Huanyan now? I asked. Chu Shirsi looked a bit awkward. Your Highness, he is currently in eastern Zhejiang, serving under the Prince of Lu. I fell silent. I had almost forgotten the biggest reason the southern Ming fell, internal division. It wasn't a lack of loyalists or brilliant generals. It was the fact that even as the country burned, the royals were busy fighting each other. It was ridiculous. When the Hongguang Emperor died, 2 different princes, the Prince of Tang in Fujin and the Prince of Lu in Zhejiang, declared themselves regents at the same time. They spent more time calling each other illegal than fighting the Qing. The Prince of Tang once sent a massive gift of silver to the Prince of Lu's troops as a peace offering, and the Prince of Lu responded by beheading the messenger. Even in my own story, while I was fleeing west, the Prince of Tang's brother declared himself emperor in Guangzhou. We ended up in a civil war while the Qing army watched from the borders, laughing. They struck while we were distracted, Guangzhou fell, and the other emperor was killed. It made my blood boil. Even now, with the country in ruins, we had 3 different governments claiming power. I didn't want to move against the Prince of Lu. If I did, I'd be no better than the other idiots who fueled the infighting. But this division had to end. Chu Shirsi saw the frustration on my face. He bowed deeply. Your Highness, you must officially take the throne. We need a clear line of authority to unite the people. He was right. By bloodline, I was the grandson of the Wanli Emperor. I was the most legitimate heir left. In history, the Yongli reign was the most recognized of the southern Ming, but it failed because the emperor was a coward who ran away. I wasn't going to run. But simply crowning myself wasn't enough. As a famous general once said, victory is the best way to solve ideological problems. My people were scattered and demoralized. I needed a win. I needed to lead a successful campaign to prove I was the rightful leader of the resistance. Fine, I said. We won't delay. Start the preparations. Over the next few days, Chen Bangyin and Zhang Jiayu arrived to take their posts. Chen didn't come alone. He brought 3,000 local militia and a plan. He told me about a general named Yu Long who had nearly 20,000 men drifting around Guangdong after the fall of Guangzhou. I can bring them into the fold, Your Highness, Chen promised. I didn't hesitate. I authorized 50,000 taels of silver from my personal treasury and the provincial vaults. This broken house of a government wasn't completely broke yet. Between my savings as the Prince of Gue and the local taxes, I had about 100,000 taels to work with. With Chu Shirsi's help, I reorganized the cabinet. Chu became the head Grand Secretary. I appointed Liu Daqi, a veteran with military experience, as Minister of War, and Chun Zizhuang as a Grand Secretary. With this core team, we began training the 20,000 regular troops we already had. By the end of the 10th month, the atmosphere in Zhaoqing was electric. After the traditional 3 refusals to show my humility, the date for my coronation was set for early November. Today, we were meeting to decide on a reign name. Chun Zizhuang stepped forward. Your Highness, you are the direct descendant of the Shenzong Emperor. To honor that lineage and the glory of the Wanli era, we proposed the title, Yongli. The officials all murmured their agreement. Yongli, eternal strength. It was the name I was born to take. But as I heard it, I felt a chill. To me, that name represented a dead end. It reminded me of being strangled in Kunming, of Li Dinghua's lonely death, and of the pathetic years spent hiding in Myanmar. Lord Chu, I said, my voice cold. In all of history, how many fallen kingdoms have actually managed to reclaim their land and restore their dynasty? The room went silent. They didn't expect such a dark question. Your Highness, Chu Shirsi replied solemnly. Since ancient times, only Emperor Guangwu of the Eastern Han has truly succeeded in rising from the ashes to rebuild the state. I sighed. Exactly. Aside from him, how many royal descendants have actually restored their mountains and rivers? There was Liu Bei, of course. He didn't finish the job, but he fought until his last breath on Chinese soil. I stood up, my voice rising with a sudden, fierce energy. Liu Bei said it best. The Han and the traitors cannot coexist. I looked at the faces of my ministers. Their expectations were heavy, but my mind was set. I wouldn't settle for a life of hiding. The Qing invaders were ruthless. They had slaughtered our people, burned our cities, and stripped us of our dignity. They had killed 2 of our emperors. This wasn't just war. It was a blood feud that could not be settled under the same sky. I told them I wanted the spirit of the great restorers of the past. I didn't want the name Yongli. To me, that name felt like a death sentence. From this day forward, I declared, my voice echoing in the silent hall, my reign shall be known as Guanglia. The room erupted. The officials were energized. This was the fire they expected from a descendant of the Taizu Emperor. They remembered the stories of the founding emperor appearing in my dreams, guiding my carriage back to the path of duty. To them, I was finally becoming the light that would lead the Ming out of the darkness. It was the 4th day of the 11th month. In the world of the Qing, it was the 3rd year of the Xuanji era. But here, outside the city of Zhaoqing, it was the 2nd year of Longwu. I stood atop a high earthen altar as ancient music filled the air. I offered incense to the heavens, the smoke rising toward a gray sky. The ceremony was grueling. I was led to a golden chair, and one by one, my top ministers, Chu Shirsi, Chun Zizhuang, and the others, approached. They dressed me in the heavy, ceremonial dragon robes and placed the crown with its 12 flowing beads upon my head. They knelt, they rose, and they kindled again, going through the rhythmic dance of imperial court etiquette. They presented me with the Great Seal, a replica we had carved ourselves, but in this moment, it felt real enough. Long live the Emperor! Long live! Long live! Their shouts thundered across the fields. Usually, the next step was to visit the Imperial Ancestral Temple to report to the spirits of the past. But there was a problem. The temple was in Beijing, thousands of miles away, now serving the very men who wanted me dead. I didn't let the ceremony end there. Instead, I turned toward the north. Clad in my black robes, I dropped to my knees on the cold ground. I, Zhu Yulang, a son who has failed his ancestors, have been unable to protect our land, I cried out. I have allowed our temples to be shamed and our people to suffer. I ask for your forgiveness. Grant me the strength to raise an army, punish the traitors, and reclaim our home." Behind me, the ministers fell to the ground, weeping. They weren't just looking at a man. They were looking at the 19th emperor of the Ming, the third since the fall of the North. I was the Guangli emperor now. The celebrations didn't last. Back in my temporary palace, the news was grim. Zhang Jieyu, the vice minister of war, brought me the latest reports. The Qing had appointed Tong Yangjia as the governor-general of Guangdong and Guangxi. More importantly, they had sent Li Chengdong as their top military commander. They were coming for us. Good, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. I was looking for him anyway. I knew Li Chengdong from the history books. He was the butcher responsible for the massacres at Yangzhou and Jiading. If I didn't kill him in this life, I didn't deserve to call myself a traveler from the future. What do you think, ministers? I asked. Lu Daqi, a seasoned veteran, looked worried. Your Majesty, Li and Tong are coming fast. Our forces are weak. We can barely defend what we have, let alone hunt them down. We won't hunt them, I replied. We'll lure them in. The Qing are arrogant. They think we're broken. I started thinking about how Li Chengdong succeeded in my original timeline. He took advantage of internal fighting between Ming factions and used captured seals to trick his way into cities. But there was no internal fighting this time. I had already taken the throne. We need a feud, I muttered. My eyes lit up. I turned to Chu Shirsi. Is the younger brother of the late Longwu emperor still in Guangzhou? I was talking about Zhu Yiyue. In history, he and I had fought a civil war that destroyed us both. If I could fake a conflict with him, I could bait the trap. The ministers hesitated. Your Majesty, it would hurt the royal family's reputation. Reputation? I snapped. If the country falls, reputation is just a fart in the wind. Winning is the only thing that matters. They went silent. I was right. We weren't fighting for glory. We were fighting to keep from being pushed into the sea like the last emperors of the Song dynasty. I gave Zhang Jieyu the task of setting the trap at Baoyuo County, a place where the mountains squeezed the road into a perfect killing bottle. Just as we were finishing, a young official stepped forward, volunteering to help. What's your name? I asked. Wang Fuji, he replied. I froze. In my old life, I'd heard people say that China never had an enlightenment like the West. They were wrong. Wang Fuji, along with men like Huang Zongxi and Gu Yanwu, were the sparks of Chinese reason and science in the 17th century. And here he was, standing right in front of me, ready to fight. The pieces were moving. The butcher was coming, but this time, I was the one waiting in the shadows. I looked at Wang Fuji and nodded. I knew what his mind represented. People in my old world thought China never had an enlightenment, but they were wrong. Men like him were the sparks of reason and science, long before the West arrived. It was the brutal military rule of the Qing that would eventually smother those sparks. History showed that 200 years later, when Japan modernized during the Meiji Restoration, their leaders were actually fans of these Ming thinkers. I wasn't going to let that light go out. I accepted his request to join us. The military pieces were falling into place. Qin Bangyan had successfully brought nearly 20,000 men back into the fold. I officially appointed Yulong as the general of Guangzhou to lead them, placing him under Qin's command. But I needed a force I could trust completely. I took 3,000 local volunteers and mixed them with 2,000 of the strongest young soldiers from the regular army. This 5,000-man unit became my Imperial Guard. I didn't want the slick veterans who had spent too much time surviving through corruption. I wanted the farm boys, the ones who were honest, tough, and didn't know how to play games. It was the same strategy the legendary General Qi Jiguang used. They lacked training, but they had grit. In this era, grit and discipline were more important than flashy swordplay because of one thing: firearms. Both the Ming and Qing used guns heavily, but the quality was usually garbage. I decided to gather every functioning fire god musket I could find and give them to my new guard. We spent our days drilling and sharpening our blades, waiting for the butcher to take the bait. And he did. In the Qing camp, Li Chengdong slammed his hand on the table and stood up. Is this source reliable? Is the Ming court really tearing itself apart? His informant nodded. The story was perfect. The word on the street in Guangzhou was that Su Guanxing, a disgruntled official, was trying to put my relative, Zhu Yue, on the throne because I hadn't given Su a high enough position. The rumor said I had sent an envoy to demand answers. Zhu Yue had panicked and seized control of 5,000 troops, and now I had dispatched Chen Bangyan with 20,000 men to crush the rebellion. Li Chengdong burst out laughing. He had just been ordered to take Guangdong, and he hadn't known where to start. Now, it seemed the little Ming court was doing the work for him. Could it be a trap? Tong Yangjia, the governor-general, asked cautiously. A trap? Li Chengdong sneered. If this were anywhere else, I'd be suspicious. But this is the Ming. Internal fighting is what they do best. He reminded Tong of how he took Yangzhou. He had seen the empty walls and feared an ambush then, too. It turned out the Ming just didn't have anyone left to fight. Just the year before, 2 Ming princes in Fujian had almost gone to war with each other while the Qing were literally knocking on their door. The Ming are full of strange things, Li Chengdong said with a grin. But their internal feuds are the one thing you can count on. Tong Yangjia grunted. He'd seen the Ming's pathetic fighting strength all the way from Beijing to Fujian. Even if there was a plot, he didn't think much of their ability to pull it off. How many men are you taking? Not too many, Li Chengdong replied confidently. I don't want to spook them and make the little emperor run away. 20,000 elites will be enough. Li Chengdong was playing his own game. He knew that as a defected general, his only value to the Qing was his army. If he could conquer Guangdong, he could turn it into his own little kingdom and act like a local warlord. Meanwhile, outside the walls of Zhaoqing, I sat on my horse, wearing red-lacquered cotton armor reinforced with steel plates. I avoided the flashy gold of an emperor to stay low profile. I watched my Imperial Guard train. I had organized them into 3 divisions. I'd managed to scavenge 600 horses to create 2 cavalry units, led by a young officer I'd promoted named Guoku. The rest were infantry. Over 40% of them carried muskets. Finding those muskets had been a nightmare. Late Ming firearms were notorious for exploding in the shooter's face because of corruption and poor manufacturing. Most soldiers preferred simple, 3-eye hand cannons because they were safer. I'd personally scoured the armories to find over 1,000 reliable matchlocks. Your Majesty, Guoku said, riding up to me. The cavalry is ready. They've been picked from the best riders in the army. I had handpicked every officer in this unit. If I wanted to survive, I couldn't just rely on remnants of peasant armies or old generals who might betray me. I needed a core force that owed everything to me. I checked the sun. By now, Li Chengdong and Tong Yangjia would be on the move. My plan was working. I had sent 5,000 men toward Guangzhou with loud banners and drums to make a scene. But the other 24,000 men? They were moving silently through the mountains of Qingyuan and Songhua. They weren't going to Guangzhou. They were heading straight for the bottle at Baoyuo County. The civil war with Zhu Yue was a total fabrication. He had thought about rebelling, sure, but the moment I marched back to Zhaoqing and took control, he'd folded like a paper tiger. Now, he was just a pawn in my game, playing the part of a rebel to lure the butcher to his grave. Wang Fuji had already slipped into Guangzhou to keep a tight lid on Zhu Yue and the local garrison. Our civil war performance had to be perfect, but a fake war wasn't enough to save a dying dynasty. I needed a real army. Since the fall of the capital, most of these soldiers hadn't seen a single copper of their wages. Their morale was gone, and their discipline had rotted away. I had Chen Bangyan distribute silver to over 20,000 Guangdong troops. It was a start. Their spirits lifted, but I didn't stop there. I handpicked 2 young censors and embedded them in the camps. I made the rules clear. If I was paying them, they weren't allowed to rob the civilians anymore. However, I gave the censors a strict warning: watch the discipline, but stay out of the military command. Your Majesty, morning drills are complete. Will you inspect the troops? 2 young generals stepped forward and knelt before me. They were Li Jingxing and Zhao Ji, 2 men I'd personally promoted from the ranks. I watched as the soldiers moved. With a heavy thud of boots, they slowly formed a massive square. I wasn't exactly impressed. To be honest, they moved slower than high schoolers doing morning exercises in my old world. Shield bearers took the front, spearmen stood behind them, and 1,000 musketeers formed the rear. I had thought about teaching them modern military formations, but after talking to my officers, I realized I was being arrogant. The legendary General Qi Jiguang had already perfected these drills centuries ago. He knew that a solid formation meant the brave couldn't rush ahead and the cowards couldn't run back. I did make some changes, though. I introduced simple, standardized commands like eyes right and quick march. The officers seemed to like the efficiency. I rode my horse past the ranks, studying their faces. They were better than the usual rabble, but we still had a long way to go. I didn't bother with a grand speech. 5,000 men wouldn't be able to hear me anyway. Instead, I looked at my 3 young generals. We move out tomorrow, I told them. Tell the men this. 5 taels of silver for every enemy head or prisoner. After the battle, I will personally meet the bravest among them. I will give them titles. I will give them rank. I looked toward the east. Everything was ready. Li Qingdong, I've been waiting for you. By the morning of November 10th, I was actually in a good mood. I had spent the night with Empress Wang. We were doing our part to ensure the Ming bloodline continued. She had lost a child before, and our relationship had been distant in the past. But I liked her. She was calm, sharp, and had a backbone of steel. When we were fleeing to Wuzhou, she didn't cry or panic. She understood the stakes. Since we'd returned to Zhaoqing, she had been my greatest ally. While I focused on the army, she led the palace women in sewing banners and uniforms. I lived a simple life to save money for the war, and she did the same, cutting palace expenses and reducing the number of servants. I had 2 other concubines, Lady Wu and Lady Zhou, but the Empress was the one I truly respected. She was more than a wife. She was a partner. But my good mood died the moment I walked into the morning meeting at the palace. He Tingjiao and Zhang Kuang were back. And like clockwork, the internal bickering started immediately. Zhang Kuang began attacking Du Yinshi, accusing him of betraying the throne. His real problem was that Du Yinshi wanted to work with the remnants of the peasant rebel armies. He Tingjiao didn't say a word, but his nodding told me everything I needed to know. Then the others joined the feeding frenzy. Ding Shikuei, Meng Jingfa, Jin Bao, everyone started shouting. They began attacking anyone they didn't like. The hall was a mess of flying spit and screaming officials. They were calling for executions and quoting ancient philosophers as if that would stop the Qing bayonets. My head throbbed. I'd been in Zhaoqing for 20 days. I knew exactly what was happening. It was all about ego. He Tingjiao and Zhang Kuang hated Du Yinshi because he was more popular with the local troops and had actually won a few battles. These Ming officials hated anyone who wasn't a pure scholar, especially former peasant rebels. He Tingjiao had even raised his own southern army of local thugs just to avoid working with the rebels. It was a disaster. These loyal troops were useless in a real fight, but they were experts at robbing the local farmers. The people of Hunan were being taxed 6 times the normal rate just to feed 3 different armies that wouldn't fight. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't even execute He Tingjiao. The man was genuinely loyal to the Ming. That was the tragedy of this era. In the southern Song, the country was ruined by villains. In the southern Ming, it was being ruined by loyal men. Men like Shi Kafa and Chu Shirsi were willing to die for me, but they couldn't stop bickering for 5 minutes. They cared more about their political purity than winning a war. They honestly believed that if the court was filled with righteous gentlemen, the invaders would just disappear. If their ideals actually worked, the Ming wouldn't have fallen in the first place. Even with the enemy at the gates, they were still trying to tear each other apart. I knew Chu Shirsi was watching this circus with a silent, approving nod. He was a great scholar, a disciple of the famous Qian Qianni, and he likely orchestrated this entire protest behind the scenes. Nothing happened in this court without his knowledge. Looking at their stubborn faces, I felt a wave of crushing disappointment. Enough, I roared. My voice cut through the bickering like a blade. The officials froze, looking at me with startled, wide eyes. How long are you going to keep this up? I demanded, standing up from the dragon throne. You argued in Beijing until it fell. You argued in Nanjing until it fell. You argued in Fujian until it fell. And now, you want to argue here in Guangdong? What's next? Are we going to jump into the sea like the last emperors of the southern Song just to keep our dignity? He Tingjiao's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He bowed stiffly, his voice trembling with indignation. Your Majesty, we are all loyal subjects. I know you're loyal, I shouted, stepping down from the dais. My blood was boiling. I know you aren't afraid to die for your country. But right now, the Ming Dynasty doesn't need pure scholars or moral examples. We need to survive. We need to take back our land. We need to win a damn war." The officials turned pale, but some still looked ready to argue. I didn't give them the chance. "You call Duinchi a rebel? You say the loyalist generals have ambition?" I laughed bitterly. I would rather have a Cao Cao or a Zhao Kuangyin in this court, a man who can actually lead a northern expedition and drive out the invaders, than 1,000 loyal men who can only talk. If someone can avenge the massacres at Yangzhou and Jiading, I don't care if he takes my throne. Give me a cup of poison and I'll drink it happily, as long as the Han people are saved. The hall went deathly silent. They stared at me as if I'd lost my mind. To a Ming official, the emperor's bloodline was everything. To suggest giving the throne to a usurper just to win a war was heresy. "Your Majesty, how can you say such things?" someone wailed, clutching his chest. "If you abandon the ancestral laws, I would rather die right here." I looked at them, really looked at them. I saw their pristine silken robes, their shaking official hats, and their tear-filled eyes. In that moment, I finally understood. These men were useless for what was coming. I couldn't rely on the old bureaucracy to fight a new, rising power like the Qing. The system was rotten to the core. "Where is the Secretariat?" I called out, ignoring their sobbing. "I'm issuing an edict. While I am away, the 3 Grand Secretaries of the Cabinet will handle all civil matters." "Away," a minister gasped. "Where is your Majesty going?" I looked him dead in the eye. "The enemy is coming. I have decided. I am leading the army myself. I will personally oversee the destruction of Li Qingdong." The hall erupted. They all dropped to their knees, begging me to stay. Chu Shirsi was crying openly now. "Your Majesty, no? Have you forgotten the Tumu crisis? The Emperor Ingzong was captured because he tried to lead the army. Do you wish to repeat that disaster?" I looked down at him. Ingzong was captured deep in enemy territory, and he still had Beijing to go back to. Where can I go? The Qing are already in Guangdong. If I go any further south, I'll be in the ocean. I would rather die on the battlefield than live as a refugee again. I swept my sleeves and walked out of the hall without looking back. Their cries followed me into the courtyard, but I didn't care. I needed prestige, and the only way to get it was through blood and victory. The next morning, I stood in the center of my army. I was dressed in full armor, a heavy blade at my waist, and a silver-inlaid flintlock tucked into my belt. I'd bought the pistol from a Portuguese merchant in Macau. It was a beautiful, reliable piece of engineering. Around me, thousands of personal guards stretched out in long lines. We had managed to scrape together 1,000 high-quality muskets, their barrels gleaming in the sun. I had the Imperial Dragon banners packed away in a wagon. I didn't want to fly them yet. It would be too obvious for an ambush. I'd raise them when the trap was sprung to shatter the enemy's morale. When I left Zhaoqing, the ministers were still kneeling at the palace gates, trying to block my path. I had ignored them. Only the Empress Dowager, and a few concubines came to see me off. The Empress Dowager cried, praying for my safe return, but Empress Wang was different. She didn't cry. She just held my hand, her eyes red, and handed me a cloak she had sewn herself. "If the worst happens," she whispered, "I will not live to see the shame." Her words stayed with me as we marched. It felt like a scene from a tragic play. But honestly, if I died, maybe I'd just wake up back in my own time. Meanwhile, the enemy was moving. Li Qingdong led the vanguard with 10,000 Han Chinese troops, followed by light artillery. Behind him was Tong Yangjia, commanding the elite Qing forces. Tong was a traitor whose family had joined the Manchus decades ago. He had nearly 1,000 Manchu and Mongol cavalry, the legendary 8 banners, plus 3,000 specialized Han infantry. They were confident. They had marched from Chaozhou to Huizhou without meeting any real resistance. To them, the Ming army was a joke, poorly trained, poorly equipped, and led by cowards. They didn't even bother sending out scouts. I stood behind the ridge of Baoyuo Mountain, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was waiting for the signal. I had 30,000 men positioned for this trap. 10,000 were hidden right here in the mountains, while another 20,000 were moving to cut off the escape routes. My 5,000 personal guards were the final reserve. I gripped the hilt of my sword, my palms sweaty. This was it. Everything, The restoration of the Ming, my life, the fate of millions, rested on what happened in the next few hours. I had a secret weapon waiting behind the ridge. 7 heavy Frankish cannons, stripped from the walls of Guangzhou, were hidden on the slope. Mules had dragged them into position, pointing down at the narrow gorge. From this height, they would be lethal. A scout rushed up to me, breathless. "Your Majesty, the Qing vanguard has entered the pass." "Begin," I said. My voice was calmer than I felt. The plan was already set. We waited until their main force reached the center of our trap. I watched a Qing soldier trekking below, clutching a long spear. He looked like any other peasant. He had been a Ming soldier once, then a rebel, and finally, he'd shaved his head to serve the Qing under Li Qingdong. He was probably daydreaming about the loot he'd find in Guangzhou. Then he saw it. A tiny black dot on the hillside. Before he could react, a plume of white smoke rose from the ridge. 7 cannonballs, fueled by gravity and gunpowder, shrieked through the air. They slammed into the Qing ranks. I watched as red mist erupted where the formation used to be. The iron balls didn't stop. They bounced off the hard earth, tearing through anyone in their path. Panic hit Li Qingdong's 10,000 Han troops instantly. But these weren't raw recruits. After the initial shock, their officers screamed orders, forcing them to turn and charge up the slopes toward us. Li Qingdong looked stunned. He wasn't just surprised by the ambush. He was surprised the Ming army actually had the guts to fight. "Fire!" I heard the command echo across the ridges. The mountainside erupted. Smoke drifted through the trees as my men unleashed everything we had. Bows, crossbows, 3-barreled pistols, and small hand cannons rained death downward. I was witnessing 17th century warfare in all its brutal glory. It wasn't like the stories I'd read. There was no instant victory. The Qing troops regrouped into small squads, using their own muskets to fire back. It became a chaotic exchange of lead and fire. The idea that modern firearms would easily crush the Qing was a myth. They actually had more guns than we did. Finally, the air became so thick with sulfur and smoke that you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The guns reached their limit. Below us, Li Qingdong drew his blade. "Brothers, break through." The sound was haunting, thousands of blades unsheathing at once. The real slaughter began. My men rolled boulders down the hills, but the slopes weren't steep enough to do much damage. We had to finish this with steel. We locked into formations, spears leveled, and charged down into the valley. The two armies collided on the gentle slopes. The roar of 20,000 men fighting hand-to-hand echoed for miles. There was no strategy anymore. It was just a mess of biting, stabbing, and screaming. I looked down at the chaos and felt a pang of sadness. Both sides looked the same. Most soldiers didn't even have uniforms. They looked like refugees with rusted swords. Only the colored headscarves told us who to kill. Suddenly, a terrified scream ripped through the air. "Cavalry! The Tartar cavalry is here." The ground began to shake. A blue cloud of dust swept in from the east. Tong Yanjiao was moving. He pointed his curved saber toward the fray, and his Manchu and Mongol riders let out a piercing, blood-curdling war cry. They drew their heavy bows. A black rain of arrows whistled through the sky and slammed into my men. Hundreds fell in an instant. The cavalry hit the battle line like a hot knife through wax. They didn't care who they trampled, Ming or Qing. They just rode through, hacking everything in sight. My heart sank. My men began to break. I thought numbers could make up for the gap in skill, but I was wrong. You can't calculate courage. My troops had been retreating for years, and the sight of the legendary Iron Cavalry was too much. The fear spread like a virus. Li Qingdong saw his chance and pushed back up the hill. "Order the personal guard to move out." I shouted to my commanders. These were my best men, meant to be my final reserve, but I had to use them now just to hold the line. "Your Majesty, General Yulong's reinforcements have arrived." I exhaled a breath I didn't know I was holding. Yulong had arrived from the mountain passes with 20,000 more men. My plan was back on track, even if we were barely hanging on. Dark waves of Ming soldiers wearing red headbands poured into the valley from both sides. We had them surrounded. I climbed onto my horse, gripping the reins. "Follow me." Into the fray. Yulong's troops crashed into the Qing like a tide, squeezing them into the center. Li Qingdong, seeing the trap closing, started pulling his remaining 4,000 men toward the eastern exit to join Tong Yangjia's cavalry. The sound of muskets was like popping corn, constant and deafening. My personal guards met Li Chengdong's veterans head-on. All the 3-volley drills we'd practiced were forgotten. Men just loaded and fired as fast as they could. My guards were better equipped, wearing light armor that saved them from the worst of the Qing fire. Tong Yangjia watched us coldly. He had 900 elite riders and 3,000 specialized infantry waiting. Yulong charged toward them with 10,000 men, but these were mostly untrained peasants. Tong Yangjia played it smart. He ordered his cavalry to back off and put his armored infantry in front. My men surged forward, a forest of spears and blades. 80 paces, 50 paces. My archers let fly. A rain of arrows hit the Qing line, but they barely flinched. Over half of them were wearing heavy plate or brigandine armor. They stood like statues, silent and terrifying. 30 paces, 20 paces. My men started to wonder if the enemy was out of ammo. They were almost on top of them. Then, the world exploded. A curtain of lead and heavy arrows erupted from the Qing line, shredding the front rank of my army in a single heartbeat. The Qing volley hit us like a tidal wave crashing against a stone wall. My front line didn't just break, it evaporated. Men screamed as they were torn apart by lead and heavy arrows, and in an instant, half of my vanguard was gone. The survivors didn't wait for orders. They saw their brothers shredded in a heartbeat and instinctively recoiled. It was chaos. The men in front pushed back, the men in back pushed forward, and the entire formation turned into a disorganized mess of human flesh. Then, the Qing adjusted. Their infantry stepped aside, revealing what they had been hiding. Behind them stood Tong Yangjia and 800 elite Manchu cavalry. They wore blue armor and carried wicked curved sabers. A massive blue dragon banner snapped in the wind behind them. They didn't hesitate. With a roar of hooves that sounded like rolling thunder, they charged in a tight wedge formation. They slammed into my confused infantry like a hot knife through butter. Yulong watched the dust cloud and the gleaming armor approaching, his face pale, his throat too dry to speak. The Qing riders didn't slow down. They trampled over our wounded, their sabers flashing in the sun. Every swing brought a rain of blood and severed limbs. With less than 800 riders, they broke 2 of Yulong's infantry groups. 10,000 of my men were being hunted like rabbits by a few hundred monsters. Blood soaked into the dirt, turning the battlefield into a red marsh. I could feel the ground vibrating under my feet from the sheer force of the charge. The Qing infantry began to close in from the sides, looking to finish off the survivors. Yulong was screaming, trying to rally his personal guards to form a defensive line, but it was useless. The Qing cavalry were driving our retreating soldiers into our own reinforcing units. If I didn't do something, this was going to turn into a total collapse. I stood there, frozen for a second. Is this it? Is this the legendary 8 Banners cavalry? They say 10,000 of them are invincible, but here, barely 1,000 were dismantling my entire dream. I felt a cold realization wash over me. If I lost here, history would just repeat itself. I'd die, the Ming would fall, and the slaughter would continue. No, I wouldn't let it happen. I gritted my teeth and looked at my guards. Raise the dragon banner. I shouted. Waku, my captain, looked at me with wide eyes. Your Majesty, your life is too precious. You can't. I didn't listen. I kicked my horse into a gallop and pointed my whip toward the carnage below. Follow me. Kill the invaders. I charged down the slope. Waku and my 600 personal guards had no choice but to follow. The massive golden dragon banner fluttered high in the wind, a bright, defiant spark in the middle of the gray smoke and red blood. Everyone saw it. The Ming soldiers recognized that flag from the long marches and the palace gates. They knew who was under it. Their emperor was charging into the fire. Tong Yangjia saw me too. At first, he looked shocked. He hadn't expected the puppet emperor to be on the front lines. Then, a look of pure greed crossed his face. If he killed me here, the resistance would die with me. He'd be a hero of the Qing Empire. Yulong saw me and felt a jolt of terror. If I died, he was finished. He drew his sword and turned on his own retreating men, hacking down a dozen cowards on the spot. Anyone else who runs dies by my hand, he roared. Turn around and fight. The fear of his blade finally overcame the fear of the Qing. He managed to pull together 4,000 men and pushed back into the center. On the other side, reinforcements under Pang Gang arrived, biting into the rear of Li Chengdong's forces. The momentum was shifting, but the real fight was right in front of me. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. I could see the patterns on the Qing banners now. We were two rivers of steel rushing toward each other at full speed. We collided. The sound was deafening. The scream of horses, the clatter of wood on metal, the wet thud of blades hitting bone. Dozens of riders on both sides were thrown from their saddles instantly. The impact shattered our formations, turning the battle into 100 small, bloody duels. I clung to my horse's mane, barely staying upright. I was a massive target. The dragon banner behind me was a magnet for every Qing arrow and blade. Tong Yangjia saw his opening. He galloped toward me, pulling a heavy composite bow from his saddle. His elite guards followed suit. They just needed one clean shot to end the Ming dynasty forever. 30 paces. 15 paces. He drew the string back until it looked like a full moon, a cruel grin on his face. I felt like a bird caught in the sights of a predator. My skin crawled. My blood felt like ice. I could see the cold glint of his arrowhead pointed right at my chest. I reached into my waistband and grabbed my secret weapon, a loaded flintlock pistol. I cocked the hammer. Zip! The arrow whistled past my ear, the wind of it stinging my cheek. Tong Yangjia's eyes widened. At that distance, he never missed, but the chaos of the charge had thrown his aim off by an inch. 10 paces. 5 paces. I could see the sweat on his face and the shock in his eyes. I leveled the pistol and pulled the trigger. Bang! Acrid smoke filled my vision. When it cleared, Tong Yangjia was clutching his throat. Blood was geysering between his fingers, staining his blue armor dark purple. He tumbled from his horse and hit the dirt, dead before he stopped rolling. For a second, the world went silent. All I could hear was the thumping of my own heart. Protect the emperor. The enemy general is dead, my guard screamed. The sight of their leader falling broke the Qing's spirit. My men, seeing the golden banner still standing, swarmed toward me. 3,000, 5,000, 10,000. They rallied around the dragon. We weren't running anymore. We were hunting. I regained my senses and drew my ceremonial sword, holding it high toward the sky. I used every bit of strength in my lungs to scream. For the Ming. Kill them all. Tong Yangjia was dead. The Manchu and Mongol cavalry, once a terrifying wave of steel, ground to a halt under the dual impact of my charge and the surrounding Ming forces. Speed is the lifeblood of cavalry. Once they stop, they are just men on horses, vulnerable to being swarmed from all sides. The battle shifted instantly into a brutal, claustrophobic melee. Guoka saw that I was safe and breathed a visible sigh of relief. He barked orders for his men to guard me at all costs, then took dozens of riders and charged straight for the Qing command center. He gripped a long-bladed saber, hacking left and right with terrifying strength. Every swing shattered armor and snapped spears. Blood sprayed like fountains wherever he passed. No one could stand against him. A moment later, amidst the roar of slaughter, the plain blue banner, the symbol of Tong Yangjia's command, shuddered and collapsed into the dirt. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a bloody red hue over the chaos. With their commander dead and their flag fallen, the Qing's resolve finally began to crumble. My scattered soldiers, seeing the dragon banner still standing tall, were rallied by their officers and surged back toward the center. We were like a colony of ants swarming a giant beetle, tearing into the flesh of the 8 banners bit by bit. It was a nightmare of iron and bone. Spears pierced the sky, severed limbs flew through the air, and men tumbled from their saddles into the mud. The earth drank its fill of blood. Li Qingdong was unrecognizable, his face masked in gore and his sword snapped in half. Of the 4,000 men he had managed to gather, less than half remained. They were pinned down by Commander Pang Gang and several other Ming units. They couldn't retreat, and they couldn't reach the Qing cavalry. Form ranks. Fire! Li Jingxing shouted, his eyes scanning the field. The crackle of muskets sounded like beans popping in a hot pan. Volley after volley tore into the Qing lines. Li Qingdong's forces were now completely cut off from the 8 banners. I surrender. I surrender. The cry started with one man and spread like a plague through the ranks of the Han Chinese soldiers serving the Qing. Their psychological defenses shattered. Li Chengdong looked around at the wreckage of the battlefield. His men were dead or kneeling. He had only 800 loyalists left. With a heavy thud, he threw his broken blade to the ground. He dropped to his knees. "Your Majesty, Li Chengdong, surrender," he screamed at the top of his lungs. Pang Gang laughed, his spear dripping with red. "Men, tie him up." Meanwhile, I led my remaining cavalry in repeated charges, mopping up the confused 8 banners remnants. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the valley between the mountains turned into a graveyard of broken armor, shattered blades, and torn banners. The plain blue banner lay discarded in a pool of filth. Tong Yangjia's elite force was finished. Out of 4,000 Manchu, Mongol, and Han soldiers, only 300 were taken alive. The rest were slaughtered where they stood. I stood in my tent, leaning on my sword, watching my soldiers clear the battlefield in the fading twilight. We had won, but my heart felt heavy. This victory had been far too difficult. I knew the Ming army was weak, but this was a wake-up call. I had used 35,000 men to ambush 15,000. I had the high ground and the element of surprise. Yet, my lines had almost collapsed twice. Even with the win, the cost was staggering. Guoku brought me the preliminary report. We had captured 4,000 of Li Chengdong's Han troops and about 200 servants from the 8 banners. As for the actual Manchu and Mongol elites, we had captured fewer than 60. The rest fought to the death. On our side, my own personal guard units had lost 1,500 men. Across the entire army, over 5,000 were dead and at least 6,000 were wounded. Even with a 2-to-1 advantage and an ambush, the casualty ratio was nearly 1-to-1. How could I ever hope to retake the north with troops like these? If I hadn't risked my own life to hold the line today, they would have scattered like frightened birds. I couldn't rely on these old, decayed Ming remnants for a long-term campaign. I needed a new army. "Your Majesty," a guard entered and knelt. "Commander Pang Gang reports that the rebel Li Chengdong begs for an audience." "Li Chengdong." I narrowed my eyes. "Is he that eager to die? Bring him in." A few minutes later, a man with a messy beard and no armor was dragged in, bound tightly with rope. Behind him stood Pang Gang, looking at me with newfound awe. Today, the Emperor had personally led the charge. I had held the dragon banner, faced the arrows, and killed the enemy general. In their eyes, I wasn't just another weak royal relative. Since the reign of the Yongle Emperor, the Ming princes had been raised like pigs, kept wealthy but powerless and soft. But today they saw something else. They saw the spirit of the founding ancestors reborn in me. "Spare me, Your Majesty. I surrender." Li Chengdong hit the floor, his forehead slamming against the ground. "I still have 10,000 veterans in Zhangzhou. I'll lead the way for you. I'll convince them to join the Ming. Please, I can be useful." He kept babbling, trying to prove his worth. I knew that in the original history, this man did eventually defect back to the Ming, but only after he had already helped the Qing conquer Guangdong. He was a snake who only cared about his own power. The old Ming court might have forgiven him. They might have given him a title and a salary just to get his troops. They would have ignored the fact that this man was one of the primary butchers behind the Yangzhou massacre and the horrors at Jiating. But I wasn't the old court. Some things aren't about winning or losing. They are about right and wrong. "Take him out," I said, my voice cold and quiet. "Quarter him with 5 horses. Then hang his head for all to see." Li Chengdong froze. He looked up, his eyes wide, thinking he had misheard. He had spent his whole life switching sides, moving from one master to the next. In his mind, as long as he had soldiers and utility, he was untouchable in this chaotic world. He was wrong. Li Chengdong didn't understand. In his mind, a man with soldiers was always a man with options. He thought that whether the ruler was Ming or Qing, they would always treat him with respect and offer him high titles and riches just to keep his army happy. "Your Majesty, I still have troops in Zhangzhou," he shouted, desperate to find a bargaining chip. "I can hand the city over to you." "I, Li Chengdong, can. I'll ask you one thing," I barked, cutting him off. He stared at me, trembling and lost. "When you were butchering the people of Yangzhou and Jiating, did you ever imagine this day would come? My finger was pointed directly at his face. Li Chengdong looked like he had been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open, his face turned as white as paper, and not a single word came out. "Drag him out," I commanded. "Execute him according to the law. Let his death be justice for the innocent souls of the South." My guards didn't hesitate. They grabbed his arms and began dragging him out of the tent. His screams for mercy echoed through the air, begging for another chance, claiming he could still be useful. Then, with a sudden, sharp cry, the noise stopped. Silence returned. Outside, the red sun was sinking behind the western mountains. My soldiers were busy setting up camp, the two peaks flanking us glowing in the fading light. Below lay the battlefield, stained red with the blood of a hard-won victory. The dragon flag fluttered in the evening breeze, and I could hear the faint sounds of my men laughing and talking. I took a deep breath. The wheels of history had finally begun to turn by my hand. News of the victory traveled fast. In Zhaoqing, the temporary capital, Wang Fuji went running into the government offices. He was only in his early 20s, a scholar I had personally promoted, and he was shouting at the top of his lungs. Victory! A great victory! The Huizhou campaign is a triumph. Officials poked their heads out of every room. For days, the court had been living in a state of high anxiety. Ever since I had clashed with Zheng Qinggong and marched east without consulting the ministers, everyone had been terrified. They were annoyed by my stubborn behavior, but they were mostly scared that the Ming dynasty was about to lose its fourth emperor in just 3 years. Chu Shixi was the first to regain his composure. He led Wang Fuji into the main hall and sat him down. "Tell us everything. Don't leave out a single detail." His Majesty led 5,000 men, Wang Fuji said, his voice shaking with excitement. "We ambushed the enemy, killed nearly 10,000, and wiped out 4,000 of the Qing's elite 8 banners. The enemy commanders, Li Chengdong and Tong Yangjia, have both been executed." The 3 senior ministers sat in stunned silence, stroking their beards. The lower-ranking officials standing by the door were completely speechless. The stories coming back were unbelievable. They heard of how, when the Ming lines were breaking, I had personally led hundreds of cavalry into the fray, charging with the dragon flag to rally the troops. They wondered if I was the reincarnation of the great founding emperors. To them, the descendants of the middle period emperors were supposed to be soft. They couldn't decide if I was a madman or a god, but one thing was now certain: my throne was rock solid. This battle changed everything. Before, the various resistance groups across China were just watching to see if my small court in the south would collapse. Now, from the peasant armies in the southwest to the warlords in Fujian, everyone had to show me respect. I had proven my resolve by charging into the thick of battle. The image of the dragon flag standing firm amidst the chaos had earned me the right to lead. "Where is His Majesty now?" Chen Zizhuang asked. "When is he returning to the capital?" "He isn't coming back yet," Wang Fuji replied. "The report says he is leading the army straight to Zhangzhou." Chu Shixi frowned. "Zhangzhou is in Fujian. That's deep in Qing territory. It's too dangerous for the emperor to be that far inland." But I was already there. Outside the walls of Zhangzhou, thousands of Ming flags fluttered in the wind. My army of 30,000 had arrived like a dark cloud. At the very front of the formation were 3,000 prisoners I had captured from Li Chengdong's army. They were tied together, looking ragged and terrified, pushed forward by the tips of our spears. Yulong, the general of Guangzhou, dismounted and knelt before me. I sat on my horse, clad in golden armor and a yellow robe, staring at the city walls. "Your Majesty," Yulong said, "the 3,000 men of the Atonement Battalion are in position. Shall we begin the assault?" I nodded slowly. "Begin." I had a specific plan for these prisoners. Most were veterans who had followed Li Chengdong from the massacres in the north all the way to the south. Their hands were stained with blood. I had formed them into the Atonement Battalion. Their job was to be the vanguard in every siege. If they survived 3 assaults or performed exceptionally well, they would be pardoned. If not, they were simply tools to wear down the enemy. "Attack! Attack!" The signal flags waved. 1,000 overseers moved forward, forcing the Atonement Battalion toward the walls. The prisoners carried simple weapons and heavy wooden scaling ladders, moving like a slow tide. On the city walls, The Qing defenders panicked. They looked down and realized the men attacking them were wearing the same uniforms they were. Many of them recognized friends and neighbors among the prisoners below. "Brothers," the prisoners shouted as they reached the base of the wall. "The emperor has 100,000 men. Surrender now. Li Qingdong is dead. Don't die for nothing." While they shouted their psychological warfare, others began to plant the ladders. The Manchu officers on the walls, their braided hair swinging as they moved, drew their swords and screamed orders. "What are you waiting for? Fire the arrows. Fire the cannons." The walls erupted in smoke. Cannons roared, sending showers of stone and lead into the ranks below. Men screamed as they were torn apart, their blood soaking the ground. But I didn't let them die alone. I ordered my own cannons forward. The Ming artillery roared back, sending iron balls screaming toward the battlements to silence the Qing guns. The sky glowed with the flashes of artillery fire as both sides traded shots. Under the cover of the smoke, the men of the Atonement Battalion strapped small shields to their arms and gripped their sabers. They began to crawl up the crude wooden ladders, moving slowly toward the top of the walls. As the cannon fire finally died down, my Ming soldiers reached the battlements. They leaped onto the stone walkways and met the Qing defenders in a brutal clash of cold steel. Blood splashed against the gray bricks. On the watchtower, a Manchu 8 Banners officer named Tenkij stood with his blade drawn. He looked like a demon in the firelight. When he saw his men wavering, he didn't hesitate to hack down several of his own soldiers who tried to flee. He was desperate to hold the line. "Hold your ground," Tenkij screamed, his face twisting with rage. "Do not retreat. Push the Ming dogs back down." Standing near him was Zhao Run, a Han Chinese general serving the Qing. Zhao Run watched the slaughter with a deep frown. He was a survivor. He had originally been a commander under the rebel leader Bai Wang, but after his leader died, he had surrendered to the Qing. He eventually became a deputy general under Li Qingdong. Because he wasn't part of Li Qingdong's inner circle, he hadn't been invited to the secret raid on Guangzhou. Instead, he had been left behind to guard Zhangzhou with 10,000 weak and elderly troops. Zhao Run wasn't really in charge here. Tenkij, a member of the Manchu Plain Blue Banner, had been stationed there to watch him like a hawk. "General Zhao," Tenkij barked, his small braids swinging as he turned his head. "Where is your execution squad? Why haven't those 2 commanders been beheaded for retreating?" Tenkij was a subordinate of Tong Yangjia, and he was furious about being stuck in this backwater city. Even though he held a lower rank than Zhao Run, he treated the Han general like a servant. He was constantly threatening the Han officers with military law. He was a hated man. Zhao Ren's eyes turned sharp. He let out a cold, mocking laugh. If Tong Yangjia's main 8 Banners army were still here, he might have endured the insults. But Tong Yangjia and Li Qingdong were both dead. Tenkij was acting like a lion when he was really just a cornered rat. There were at least 40,000 Ming troops outside the walls. Inside, Zhao Ren had fewer than 9,000 exhausted, broken soldiers. Even if they somehow held Zhangzhou, how many men would he have left? A general without an army had no value to the Qing. He knew his fate if he stayed. A cold light flashed in the air. The sound of a blade cutting through the wind echoed across the tower. Tenkij's eyes widened in shock. He reached up, clutching his throat, but the blood was already spraying through his fingers. He tried to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out as red foam bubbled at his lips. He collapsed, staring at the man who had finally snapped. "We are willing to surrender to the heavenly army," Zhao Ren shouted, his voice booming over the walls. "Open the gates. We surrender to His Majesty the Emperor." Led by Zhao Run and his personal guards, the soldiers turned on the few remaining Manchu loyalists. They cut them down where they stood. Across the battlements, the Han soldiers who had been fighting for the Qing began to drop their weapons in waves. I stood below with my generals, looking up at the smoke-filled towers. The sounds of screaming and clashing metal began to fade. Then came a heavy, metallic sound that echoed through the valley. Clang! The massive gates of Zhangzhou swung open. The path was clear.